This video is going to be on spurious correlation, or another way of saying it is this way: correlation does not prove causation. What does that phrase mean? Correlation does not prove causation means this: just because one event follows another event does not mean the first event caused the second event to happen. For instance, here's a kind of a humorous example from the past. Years ago, they did a study in Seattle, Washington, and what they looked at were extended periods of cloudiness and rain that lasted for 1 to 2 weeks. And then they looked at 9 months later, approximately more or less, and what they noticed was that after you have a period of extended rain for 1 or 2 weeks, and you go 9 months later, guess what? The birth rate goes up. Therefore, they concluded that more women get pregnant on rainy days. Now, the question becomes, what's really the cause of the pregnancy? What is causing the pregnancy? Well, it's not the rain, is it? No, of course it's not the rain. What's causing the pregnancy is the fact that people stay at home, and when they stay at home, they, maybe want to get warm, and they get too warm, and before you know it, they have a little bambino. So really, it's not the rain, it's the staying at home and all those things that go along with it. This is called a spurious correlation, like a false correlation. Now, why is this important? Because sometimes people latch on to false correlations and policy gets based on it. A classic example involves the use of marijuana. And let me tell you how it works, okay? If I take a group of heroin addicts, and I have 100 heroin addicts sitting in a room, and I ask these heroin addicts, hey, how many of you, before you used heroin, ever tried or used marijuana? What you'll probably get is that 99 to maybe even 100 of these heroin addicts will tell you that prior to using heroin, they had tried or used marijuana. Therefore, people will conclude erroneously that marijuana use leads to heroin. In fact, this spurious correlation, this false correlation, has been the basis of some of the marijuana policy in making it illegal, because they look at heroin addicts and go, my gosh, heroin addicts admit they use marijuana prior to using heroin, therefore marijuana contributes to or causes heroin use. That's the old theory. You've heard this is called the gateway drug, marijuana the gateway drug, the stepping stone theory of drug use. The problem with this is that it's not true. Let me give you an example of how to prove it. Take those same heroin addicts and say, okay, how many of you prior to using heroin drank beer? You know what you're going to get? You're going to get all 100. Hey, prior to using heroin, how many of you drank coffee? You're going to get all 100. Prior to using heroin, how many of you smoked cigarettes? You're going to get an awful lot, I'll guarantee you that. Prior to using heroin, how many of you went to church? Probably all of them. Therefore, coffee, church, cigarettes, and beer lead to heroin addiction? No, of course not. They don't lead to heroin addiction at all. It's just the fact that before people used heroin, they did a lot of other things. And here's how you have to look at it. People who use heroin rarely make heroin the first drug they ever use. Almost always they've tried other things. They've tried illegal and legal drugs. They've tried beer, wine, whiskey, what have you. They've drank coffee. And if they've experimented with illegal drugs, they probably have tried marijuana. In other words, people rarely start with heroin as the first drug they use. So therefore, to say that because you use one drug, you're going to go ahead and use heroin doesn't make any sense. And in fact, when we look at marijuana users, we find that very few marijuana users ever go on to use heroin, which is also true with beer users and coffee users and churchgoers and etc. So you can look at it that way and correct it. You also have to be careful, because once we start believing in these spurious and false correlations, we try to defend them. For instance, you hear people say things like, well, people use marijuana and they get tired of the high, so therefore they want to try the heroin high. Want that bigger rush. Well, why don't you say that about beer? You get tired of drinking beer, you want to try heroin. Get tired of having wine, you want to try heroin. You get tired of coffee, you want to try heroin. You could say that to anything. That makes no sense. That argument is this senseless. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, when heroin addicts can't get heroin, they don't try marijuana. What they go to are drugs that depress the central nervous systems. They may go to barbiturates, they may even go to alcohol, but not marijuana. Marijuana is entirely different category of drugs. In other words, if a heroin addict is seeking the heroin drug effect, he's not going to get it from marijuana. Marijuana doesn't give the same effect. He can get it from barbiturates. He may get it from various forms of synthetic opioids. and maybe somewhat close would be alcohol, but not marijuana. So this is a discussion again of spurious correlation, or correlation does not prove causation.